My name's Catherine. I'm from Yorkshire CND, and I've been asked to facilitate this session in the place of Dave Webb, who was on the original leaflets, who's the convener of Yorkshire CND. And as we have two key US bases in Yorkshire, Yorkshire CND has historically taken a lead in campaigning on issues of weapons in space and on US missile defence. So that's why I'm here.
Where are the bases? Farmingdales?
Don't interrupt me for now. I'm going to come on to that. I'm going to speak about Menwith Hill in particular in just a few minutes in the context of emerging weapons. But firstly, I should introduce the two speakers. You're probably all aware that Professor Stephen Rose wasn't able to make it today due to family illness, which is a shame. He was going to speak to us about neuroweapons, and hopefully we'll be able to find an opportunity at some point in the future to hear about his role in looking at neuroscience in the context of conflict and security. So David Leal has stepped up at the last moment. He's from London Region CND, and he tells me that he works in semantic technologies, and I'm going to have to leave that to him to explain what that means. And on my left, we've got Chris Cole, who I'm sure many of you already know. He's been campaigning for years against arms drones and is the convener of Drone Wars UK. So I thought maybe to start off, I should just outline why I think that this topic about new and emerging weapons is really important for us in CND and the broader peace movement. As you'll know, the landscape of the 21st century battlefield has massively changed from the past, where we had two large opposing armies clashing on an open battlefield. From the use of targeted killings by armed drones to the use of computer viruses to bring down enemy weapons systems, weapons of war are changing very rapidly. And things that seem remote possibilities right now may well become reality in the not too distant future. Things such as autonomous robotic weapons systems, which are mentioned in the paper that came with the pack at the beginning of the meeting. Automated armed vehicles, satellite-launched electromagnetic pulse weapons to attack the electricity grids and the command and control and communication centres of enemies. Even possibly the biologically or robotically enhanced soldiers, not to mention the neuro weapons, sound-based weapons, electromagnetic non-lethal weapons. These are all futuristic sounding things which may well become reality fairly soon. And for us in the peace movement, these developments are not just horrific in and of themselves, but they obviously have huge ethical and legal implications. So we really do need to educate ourselves, and soon, about this new world of warfare, the better to effectively campaign against it. So I was asked to speak briefly about Menwith Hill in the context of emerging weapons. And you'll think, well, what is new about Menwith Hill? It's obviously a US base, a spy base in Yorkshire. It's been around for an awfully long time. Yorkshire CND and the campaign for the accountability of American bases has been raising its insidious military role for many years, as opposed to the slightly more benign radio response role that was its cover story for many decades. But actually, it's the information that's been released by Edward Snowden that has allowed a much greater insight into how far Menwith Hill can reach globally, and importantly, what that information is being used for. Because it's the lethal use of this surveillance data that has put Menwith Hill, this base near Harrogate, on the front line of conflicts that are being fought many thousands of miles away. I don't want to go into the technical details of how Menwith Hill does that. If anybody is interested, I suggest you look at the investigative journalist Duncan Campbell's website. He's got an awful lot of excellent data on there. But just to say briefly, Menwith Hill, unlike many other spy bases around the world, which can tap into cable and fibre optic communications, Menwith Hill is concerned with tapping into eavesdropping on communications as they are beamed through the air between satellites. And it's got two main spying capabilities. One that is known as Fornsat, which uses those golf balls that if you've ever been to Menwith Hill, you'll be very familiar with, to listen in as information is being passed between foreign satellites. And then it's got the overhead, which uses US government's own satellites to, which are orbiting above targeted countries to locate and monitor communications on the ground, such as phone calls or Wi-Fi calls and this sort of thing. So Men with Hill can harvest literally millions of emails and phone calls every single day. And papers released by Edward Snowden pointed out in 2011, Men with Hill trialled what it called a new collection posture known as collect it all, which is basically fairly self-explanatory. They are collecting massive amounts and then sifting through it. But as I said before, it's what's been done with this information that is important to us in the peace movement. So the NSA, which stands for National Security Agency, US, has used Men with Hill to aid a significant number of capture-kill operations across the Middle East and North Africa. And of course, we always knew that this was going on, but the papers released by Edward Snowden provided direct evidence. For example, about a program called Ghost Hunter, which was developed to directly aid military operations locating targets when they log on to the internet. Some very brief examples of this, just to give you a flavour of what actually happens on the ground. In 2007 in Lebanon, analysts at Men with Hill used Ghost Hunter to track down an Al-Qaeda facilitator described as highly actionable, meaning they want to get him or kill him. He was traced to within 200 metres of his location. Then a spy satellite was sent to take photographs of the area. This was all passed on to Special Operations Task Force 11-9. What became of him is not clear from the papers released by Snowden. The same year in Iraq, an Al-Qaeda weapons procurer, Ghost Hunter, tracked him down to an internet cafe. The spy satellites took photographs, passed to commanders based in Fallujah, and a mission was undertaken where him and several associates were arrested. Papers from 2009 say that Ghost Hunter focused on the geolocation of internet cafes in the Middle East and North Africa and boasted that it had successfully located over 5,000 VSAT terminals. That's very small aperture terminals, basically the sort of devices used by internet cafes and foreign governments to pass information. 5,000 of these terminals in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Syria and Lebanon. But Men with Hill can also home in on VSATs in Pakistan, Somalia, Algeria, the Philippines, Mali, Kenya and Sudan. And this is important because Men with Hill is providing support not just for conventional military operations, but also is aiding covert missions in countries such as Yemen and Pakistan, where the US or the UK has not declared war. In 2010, an internal report spoke of a new technique at Men with Hill to identify many targets, almost 40 internet cafes in Yemen's Shabwa province and Sana'a, and that was called Ghost Wolf, and it was the first documentary evidence that we had to directly tie in Men with Hill to covert operations in undeclared war zones. So Men with Hill is a US spy base, but our government has always said that it operates under the jurisdiction with the full knowledge and consent of the UK government. So this is directly implicating GCHQ personnel in actions which may well be breaking international and British law and basically putting themselves as, put bluntly, accessories to murder. So I would also mention Crowton, but you go on to mention Crowton a little bit, so I'll leave that for now. But information as a weapon of war, as I've just described, can also be used in a slightly different way. As I mentioned, the insertion of computer viruses into enemy programs, as happened into the Iran's nuclear weapons program a while back. The recent hacking scandal in the US is another example of how information is being used in a kind of Cold War scenario where Russia is standing accused of directly intervening in the US election. And that's just a small snapshot of how information is being used within modern warfare. And unfortunately, it's not just the information being used as a weapon itself, but that the use of this information is making conventional warfare more likely. The 2016 NATO summit is anti-NATO here. I hope she realises I'm mentioning NATO. The 2016 NATO summit in Warsaw increased the possibility of NATO taking collective military action because it identified cyberspace as an operational domain alongside air, land and sea. So in that sense, cyber attacks could potentially trigger an Article 5 military response, i.e. an attack on one is an attack on all. And this is very worrying because the source of such cyber attacks is very, very difficult to find, and the information is rarely clarified or shared between nations. So, just like in the last session, the conclusion being that we're living in an increasingly dangerous world. And I'd like to hand over now to Chris, who'll maybe shed more light on just how dangerous a world we're living in.
Thank you very much, Cath. Well, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here. Like you all, I was a bit, I'm sure, a bit stunned and shocked by that last session. Thanks. I was a bit shocked and stunned by that last session. I think all of us have seen or not really wanted to think about the Trump, God help us, presidential administration that's coming towards us. But it is important that we have these sessions to come together and to think about how we can resist, how we can campaign to build peace and security under a Trump administration. I was asked to kind of talk a little bit about drones in particular and how they impact on warfighting strategies. And while it's important for us to think about how those particular technologies are impacting on warfighting strategies, the first thing to say about them is that they are about, in lots of ways, rehabilitating war. Throughout the 20th century, what had previously been seen as glorious and heroic was increasingly seen as threadbare, wasn't it? You know, from the disaster of the war to end all wars, you know, onto World War 2.0 and the thousands killed in the Second World War. Then the threat of nuclear annihilation in the Cold War, and then the humiliation of US military might in Vietnam and Russian military might in Afghanistan. By the end of the 20th century, the public and war was seen almost as, you know, threadbare, you know, not a way to solve political problems. And there's been a real pushback since then to rehabilitate war and to get the public back on board with seeing war as a means of solving political crisis. And drones are very much part of that. You know, undertaking remotely controlled strikes from the safety of air-conditioned bunkers thousands of miles away. Drones, we are told, enable us to simply and cleanly take out the bad guys with no risk to our own forces. Through what's called persistent presence, drones loitering over a particular area for hours, days, even weeks in turns, and what they call exceptionally precise, pinpoint accurate strikes. Drones are changing the nature of warfare, or so we're being told. War is no longer the hell that it once was. Well, we all know, of course, that's nonsense. The reality is very different. Drones are simply enabling much more war, as they make it much easier for politicians of all shades to undertake military intervention, as there is much less political risk with no boots on the ground. The public simply don't like to see young men and women sent overseas come back in body bags and coffins. And if we can undertake military intervention without that risk, it swings the balance back in favour of military intervention. And until recently, very recently, I was saying that only 3 countries had used armed drones to launch strikes: the US, Israel and the UK. But over the last 12 months, 18 months, a number of other countries, some surprising, have joined that club. Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan and Iraq itself have all used remotely controlled drones to launch strikes. Not thousands of miles away. They don't have the communications architecture, the infrastructure of satellite communications, but they are now able to use drones within their own territory, within, say, 500 or 600 kilometers, so into their neighboring country. So countries like Turkey have now used drones to launch strikes at PKK in Syria. So over the next few years, we're going to see a vast expansion of the use of drones. Not just some of these second-tier countries, but also what could be called second-tier countries in terms of the second wave, but also France and Italy and the Netherlands, who all have Predator and Reaper drones, will be arming them over the next few years. Last autumn, like many of you, I think, and I'm sure like Cath and others from Yorkshire and CND, we took part in Keep Space Peace Week, and I went to RAF Croughton, which is a base about 10 miles away from Oxfordshire. And Croughton is one of those bases that's described as RAF, but as we all know, is thinly disguised or even hardly disguised as a US base. And like Menwith Hill, it's described as this communications hub helping to transmit benign information around the globe. But the reality is, like Menwith Hill, Croughton is a kind of vital cog in what US journalist William Arkin has called the data machine. Now, we've been familiar for decades, I think, with the military-industrial complex. You know, how these two entities, the defence industry and the military, work together in their own interest to promote the efficacy of war, if you like, and also how war is being fought. But since the end of that 20th century, since that wanting to rehabilitate the idea of warfighting, the intelligence community has been very much brought into that. So we now have the military-industrial intelligence complex and what we can call a data machine, if you like. And in many senses, drones are just the visible face of that military intelligence industry machine. And that's, as we all know now, sucking up huge amounts of data day by day. You know, which phone is talking to which phone? You know, which IP address is sending emails to which IP address? And so on and so on. And turning all this huge amounts of intelligence into data and using computer algorithms and sophisticated programs to analyze that data, which in then turn kind of coughs up a kind of another name of a person to be, as they call it, found, followed, and fixed by the drones. And of course, the UK is very much part of this. And as Cath mentioned, much of this, of course, is officially denied. But thanks to Edward Snowden and a number of important journalists like Duncan Campbell, we have the evidence, and we very much know that Menwith Hill is very much involved in the US illegal drone strikes in Yemen and elsewhere. And Croughton actually has a direct communications connection with a base Camp Laminiere in Djibouti in Africa. So despite these denials, we don't very much know that these bases are involved, and that's one of the hallmarks, I think, that we will see in future about drone war. We see it in drone war now. It will be expanded in the future, and that's secrecy and lies. Sometimes this is slightly ridiculous. Like you will remember a year or so ago, David Cameron announced that the UK was buying 20 new Protector drones. And lots of journalists will ring me up. What's this new Protector drone? Of course, it was just the renamed Predator drone. They know that the public don't like this idea of Predators and Reapers, so they wanted to give them these cuddly new names, the Protector drones. But they are exactly the same. So as I say, sometimes these are slightly ridiculous, but other times they're much more serious, like the issue of civilian casualties, of course. We're told constantly that drones and smart weapons are so precise that they can virtually eliminate civilian casualties. Because we're told that they can fly longer and sit and loiter, they can sit above the kind of fog of war and launch pinpoint accurate strikes. But unfortunately, this is nonsense. As some of you will know, Reprieve, the human rights organisation, investigated 41 particular strikes in Pakistan, where 41 strikes against named individuals that the US wanted to kill. And 1,100 people were killed in those 41 strikes, targeting those 41 people. In 2013, US military analyst Larry Lewis investigated and researched and looked at airstrikes in Afghanistan, US and UK airstrikes. And he said that drones killed 10 times more civilians than manned aircraft, person, staff, whatever you want, piloted. But we're not allowed to see the data. The data has been classified and we're not allowed to see that. And in Iraq and Syria, of course, the UK still insists there hasn't been a single casualty, not even an injury, a scratch to a civilian in more than 1,200 airstrikes, launching 2,500 weapons. And the very term airstrike is a complete misnomer now. You know, when we think of an airstrike, we think of one weapon being launched at one target. But airstrikes, the airstrike in which Syrian soldiers were killed towards the end of last year, that was a number of different countries, Denmark, the UK, the US, Australia, launching dozens, well, we're not exactly sure how many, but more than dozens of weapons at this target. And it was counted as one airstrike by all these different aircraft. So, you know, the term airstrike itself is a part of this secrecy and lies. And of course, it should be remembered that, you know, civilian casualties from airstrikes are not just accidents. We kind of tend to think, well, they're just accidents, you know, it's just mistakes. But sometimes if it's absolutely clear that civilians will be killed, strikes still go ahead. In 2003, for instance, Donald Rumsfeld authorized more than 50 strikes that would kill more than 50 civilians. Knowing full well that these 50 civilians would be killed, he authorized more than that, and that was happening more than 50 times in the Iraq War. Last year, the US changed its rules of engagement to allow on-the-ground commanders to kill more than up to 10 civilians per strike. So civilians being killed in airstrikes are not just accidents, of course. And it's not just about precision and accuracy, and we can say much more about this, but I'm slightly concerned about time. But we're not allowed to know where British drones are deployed, for example. We know exactly how many Typhoons and Tornadoes and Sentinel and all the other British aircraft, where they're deployed to and how many are deployed. We're not allowed to know how many British drones are deployed or where they are. We're pretty sure we know where they are, but, you know, officially this is all kept secret. So drones are being treated very differently. And the reason that is because the UK wants to have the option, at least, of using them covertly, like the US does. So secrecy and lies is very much part and parcel and a hallmark of the drone wars, as is the expanding use of targeted killing, what we all used to call assassination, what the lawyers call extrajudicial killing. And I have to say I was completely shocked when the UK targeted the 21-year-old Rayad Khan from Cardiff in 2015. For years, the UK had distanced itself from the US targeted killing program, and I had many private conversations with people who said that they simply wouldn't do that. And it wasn't long ago, of course, that targeted killing, assassination was a complete anathema. Even the US, before 9/11, was condemning publicly Israel for its targeted killing of Palestinians. But now with the drone wars, of course, it's become completely normalised and almost acceptable. And this week, some of you will have seen the Attorney General set out in the speech some of the legal arguments, very threadbare again, but arguing that there doesn't even need to be evidence of a specific attack before these drone strikes can take place. So what many people won't know, of course, about the kind of reporting about the killing of Rayad Khan is not great. He was on his way out of hospital. He was been in hospital after being injured in a previous drone strike. And it very much reminds me, I don't know, one of the best books on drone wars is Chris Wood's, who's a journalist who's written a book. and he talked to ISAF, International Security Force officers in Afghanistan, and they had this situation where they had not enough evidence to hold this Taliban commander, but they had enough evidence to kill him. So there was this very bizarre conversation about at what point after we let him out can we drone him. So that's the kind of situation where we're in with the drone wars. There's not enough evidence to put someone in court, but they think there is enough evidence to target and kill them. So where are we? And there's no shame about it, of course. You know, last year, some of you will remember, the US Congress castigated, and we will hear much more of this now with President, God help us, Trump. The US Congress was castigating Europe for not doing enough on the war on terror, for not spending enough money on NATO. And Michael Fallon pointed to the fact that he allowed the US to use a British base to undertake the targeted killing of Muqtada al-Mukhtar in Libya last year. So the UK isn't just condemning targeted killing, it's boasting now that it's very much about it. And that's part of the consequences of these drone wars. And of course there is the whole idea of how drones are lowering the threshold for warfare. The US has been using their drones to cross into Pakistan, thereby, I would argue, lowering the threshold for the use of force. But also the UK did it with Syria, I would argue. In the September 2014 resolution, it was very explicit. MPs were saying that there should only be the use of military force against ISIS in Iraq. Within weeks, 6 weeks, armed British drones were crossing into Syria, and the MOD insisted that this was only for surveillance, only for intelligence gathering. It's not military action, they were saying. How ludicrous is that compared to when Russian aircraft come in international airspace somewhere near the UK? There is this quick reaction force which lands off, and it's a big scandal in the press that Russian aircraft are coming near the UK. But when armed British drones are crossing into Syria, again, this is before the parliamentary vote authorising the use of force in Syria. They were describing it as just intelligence gathering, not military action. So drones are very much using lowering the threshold for the use of force. So I just want to finish by saying, this is getting worse, and we will see this getting worse. Last year, Amy Zegart, who is an American academic who is involved in this work, wrote in the Wall Street Journal, and I'll quote her, she said, "Lethal drones make possible a new form of coercion, targeted hurting. Targeted killing are designed to take the enemy off the battlefield, but targeted hurting is designed to change an enemy's behaviour by destroying selectively the family members, the friends, the associates or the villages of those the enemy holds most dear." So it's shocking and completely illegal, but this is the way that this remote technology is lowering the threshold for force and making not just the pilots, there's this whole issue about whether pilots are more likely to use force because of the great distance, psychological and physical distance. But it's also making policymakers and politicians and academics lowering the threshold for the use of force. So there's much more that can be said about the use of drones, and I hope we can get onto some of that in questions and answers. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. It seems like a cliche to say that it's Orwellian, but when you hear about drones being changed from predator to protector, you realise quite how close to the mark George Orwell was. So can I ask David now to talk about his semantic technologies?
Well, I just put a little bit in the picture here. The reason why we have having this session, what really prompted this as one of the key sessions, was a resolution to the National CND AGM talking about we need to look at the big picture of emerging weapons, and London region and Yorkshire have really taken the lead on this, and there are a number of related technologies. Obviously drones is one of them, There's the biological ones, which Stephen Rose would have been here if we were talking about if he was able to be here. I want to touch on a couple of other related ones. One is the use of autonomous weapons, so where it is distinctively different from drones, where there's somebody driving it as a sort of super computer game. Instead, we're moving to weapons are deployed out there, they are finding their own targets and they are taking their own decisions. And the technical possibility is there. And as soon as we move from wars against poor people who can't jam communications to wars against other major state actors, then suddenly these weapons are going to be switched from computer game mode to operating autonomously, because it's just a question of software. And the other thing which I want to touch on briefly is the vulnerability of civilian infrastructure. I mean, Chris talked about targeted strikes, but of course, if we start targeting electricity substations, water distribution, sewage plants, and again, if we start doing this not on third world cities, which can be very resilient because they don't have very complicated infrastructures, but to an industrial city, these targeted strikes can render a city of several million people uninhabitable. So that these are the two topics. I think there are many others, and later on this year, I think CND is going to bring together a conference which looks at the topics together. I actually have a couple of overheads, if I can show them. This technology is not necessarily military technology. In 1973, there's a famous report on robotics, which by Professor Leal, who said, robotics and artificial intelligence will never get anywhere, and withdrew all government funding. And that was 43 years ago. And since then, it's all gradually changed. And the two areas, both of which are relevant to us, one is that we have systems which look at patterns, can recognise faces. We all know that passports, automated passports, it recognises your face. Systems which recognise patterns of behaviour. But the drones rely on operators spotting the difference between a wedding and a meeting of insurgents. Last month, a European research project funded by European transport utilities, underground systems, launched a system which would recognise a robbery in terms of understanding the pattern of people, or recognise a mugging, so that you didn't need to have people looking at the video screens. And this is teaching systems to recognise situations and recognise hazardous situations. We actually have the same technology with the automated cars which are currently driving around California, where the cars respond to traffic incidents and can navigate perfectly happily. The reason why they're not deployed already is legal ones, and you can't guarantee 100% reliability, and Daimler-Benz don't really want to be sued if there's a road accident. But of course, if it's military, it doesn't really matter so much. Nobody's going to sue the DOD or whatever. So these things are out there, and this is one aspect. It's teaching computers to do what soldiers and pilots do instinctively, or quickly, not consciously. They recognise a threat situation, select a target, fire a weapon. The other development has been looking at conscious thought processes, automating logical deductions, using systems to run power stations, spot faults, schedule trains through junctions. And again, this is if you do the banking, banks spot dodgy payments and send you a text message, at least some banks do. And how is this? Because they have computer systems which are looking, this payment doesn't look quite right, and sends you a message, did you really mean to do this? And of course, this is now used for controlling power stations, water and sewage works, and increasingly we have the jargon is the Internet of Things, dishwashers, washing machines, central heating systems, all be linked to the web, all can develop through this technology. So this is all civilian technology, a lot of it. And what it means is it's cheap, mass-produced, and also is deployable with inside weapons. So if you put the two together, you've got the pattern recognition, which responds very quickly to sort of a hazard situation, spots somebody stepping out of a building, oh, it's a target. And the logical inference, maybe we need to go back and refuel, get new supplies of weapons. Put the two together and you have an autonomous weapon. And it's cheap and it works inside existing systems. It's just software. And so this is happening, and Chris has been talking about aerial drones, but they're the small ones, not talking about unmanned fighter jets. But the people at Lockheed Martin's 5 years ago said that they had designed their last manned fighter. The F-35 was the last. All future programs inside Lockheed Martin are for unmanned vehicles. And these will be autonomous. They will be finding their own targets. They'll be fighting dogfights all by themselves and then returning to base. No pilots on board and no communications. They will do it all by themselves. We have autonomous underwater vehicles. And of course this is, I think it's already been mentioned, this sort of threatens the integrity of Trident, but nobody actually cares very much about British Trident. What it actually threatens is it threatens the mutually assured destruction on which we relied, that either the Russians or the Americans might start to believe that they can now track all the opposition submarines because they have sufficient drones out there. Because they're cheap, they can be manufactured, submarines cost billions as we know, the drones will be a few tens of thousands, even a submarine one. Unmanned, obviously unmanned vehicles, the Russians are exporting them. With a picture of that it's not that difficult. I mean, if Tesla and Google can export unmanned cars, we'll put a gun on it and get a bit of tracks. It's not that difficult. In October last year, the Royal Navy had an exercise called Unmanned Warrior, which is a rather nice title. I always thought warriors were people, the fact that unmanned as an Unmanned Warrior. And clearly it's sort of demonstrating that they're starting getting on board, and I think the quote there is quite important, that these are technologies developed elsewhere which are now being deployed inside weapons. And I think Chris talked about making the technologies, making it acceptable. People weren't getting killed, the precision strikes. But there's also the problem is in making it cheap. And I think that's a real problem, that unmanned vehicles are much cheaper and they're completely expendable. And it is just another stage in lowering the barrier to warfare. So I think that was that's one side of the two topics we really wanted to add into this emerging weapons thing. And the other one is actually looking at the vulnerability of civilian infrastructures to these weapons. The cyber attacks on the Iranian centrifuges we all know about, but the thing is that almost everything we work with in terms of providing infrastructure is computer controlled. The water supply system, sewage, railway signalling, the electricity substations, the oil refineries, they are all computer controlled. And again, it's driven to a large extent by cost, the more we can take people out. I mean, the military like to don't want casualties, but the employers don't like to employ people. It's much cheaper if you can get computers to do it. And so this makes the systems extremely vulnerable to attack, but it also means that they're extremely interlinked. One more slide. And one of the slides which I are sort of looking, or there's a jargon word called sort of the global system failure or urban system failure, and the Americans are looking at it from the point of view of climate change. Actually, they were looking at floods and hurricanes and all that sort of thing. But if you consider the consequences of a loss of electricity supply for even a few days in a modern city, a city like Baghdad or Damascus can probably cope with a loss of electricity supply. It's always been erratic and people have oil lamps. If we actually have London without electricity for days, first of all, it's dark, people can't get about, petrol pumps won't work, you can't buy food because the supermarkets won't be able to sell you stuff. But even things like, well, the supermarkets have supply chains, and how do the supply chains work? Well, they send emails from computer to computer, and if they haven't got any power, the food supply chains don't work, let alone the refrigeration. So we can see that actually taking out civilian infrastructure through targeted strikes is now a weapon which is equivalent to nuclear weapons, but certainly causes mass disruption, could cause millions of people to flee a city. And so this is a threat which can be held against any urban city. So I've sort of contributed 2 more areas to this emerging weapons. We've got drones, we've got autonomous weapons which pick their own targets, can be deployed sort of, just about to say, lurking in the undergrowth. There's no soldiers there, but there are weapons moving around within the civilian population, and the only casualties will be civilians. And then we also have the dangers of our infrastructure.
I wonder if you share with me the thought that it's kind of an occupational hazard as a member or working for CND to be shocked and horrified and scared about the future of the world. I hope that in the discussion that follows, maybe we can shed a little bit of positivity on the future, certainly in terms of any energy behind campaigning against these developments. So we've got about 10 to 15 minutes now for contributions from the floor. So if you just indicate, and I'll try and include as many people as we've got time for. So starting with the woman right at the back, please.
So how vulnerable are our nuclear power stations to such an attack?
I'll let you take that because it's a very direct question, and I think maybe it's directed at you.
Maybe less vulnerable than some of our other things, because that's been considered a lot. Going for, say, the water supply system is much easier. If you want to pick a soft target, you wouldn't pick a nuclear power station. They're rather conservative, and in a lot of cases still work on very old-fashioned technology. They're not trying to penny pinch. The water companies may well be trying to save money by installing super whiz-bang new computer equipment. So, I mean, that sounds optimistic, but, that the problem is that where the danger is obvious, steps are taken. But then you look at the system as a whole, you see all sorts of vulnerabilities. Who does the flood prevention and operating the Teddington Lock? Teddington Lock might be vulnerable because nobody's ever considered it.
Until now. And the man up there on the left.
I'd like to ask David, have you anything to say about the possibility of using electromagnetic pulse? A nuclear weapon detonated low over.
Yeah, it would. Yes, absolutely.
Knock out the entire
Yes.
within a year, most of us would be dead.
Yes. Yeah. No. Absolutely. I've nothing to add.
Okay, I'll take 3 questions now. Four questions all together, and then let the speakers come back on those. So,
The question of the drones, the question of defence against the drones hasn't been mentioned, I don't think. I was thinking in terms of Israel, which would be very, worried about drones. They must be working on a defence system. It doesn't seem to me, judging by what's been said about the way the computer can deal with it and radio signals could deal with it. Is there any news of defence? If there's no defence against it, then, or if there is a defence against it, that will give the powers with technological knowledge the great advantage over those powers that haven't got it.
Yes.
thank you. A question here.
The technologies at the moment, they're promoted by people who want to promote the technologies. We haven't got any major research on how to prevent this and control it. Is it necessary for the UN to set up a major agency and a major plan which can actually locate these things and ultimately control it? Is that what we should be agitating for, so that we don't get into an anarchic situation, which I think is the danger?
Okay, thank you. The man up there on the right.
Okay, I'd like to be provocative and say there's an infamous remark from, I think, something called the National Rifle Association in the United States that says, guns do not kill people, people kill people. And could one somewhat put it differently and say, drones do not kill people, people kill people. And so if we go to discuss drones, we're going to discuss the technologies that can lead to mass murder or killing a lot of people. Shouldn't we be focusing on the important question of why do people commit acts of violence? Why are there people in Britain and the United States, throughout the entire world, who firmly believe that violence is unavoidable, legitimate, effective, and so on and so forth? In other words, what I'm trying to say is, after a delineation or an examination of the weapons that are used, we should head straight to the human mind. I think UNESCO's constitution says, since wars begin in the minds of men, it is to the minds of men we must turn if we are to construct the defense of peace. So I would like to hear the speaker say, how do we bridge that gap? How do we move away from discussing the technologies into discussing philosophical and doctrinal and other belief systems that actuate the production of weapons?
Okay, thank you for that interesting question. And there's a woman here.
Coming from another angle, this is discussion is military and political about weapons development. How far do you think that the core driver is the corporate profit from the development of this?
Okay, thank you. I'll let you both come back on those points. Do you want to start?
Defences against drones here. Yes, I mean, it kind of, you specifically mentioned Israel, and one of the things that Israel has is this Iron Dome system, which some people may know, which is a virtually autonomous, and it's one, when we talk about autonomous weapons, the Iron Dome is heading very much towards that way, because, as you say, weapons are, whether it's not just drones, but it's rockets that are coming towards Israel. And they have to have this kind of auto system that kind of responds to take out the rockets or the drones. And there is a person in the loop, because there has to be under current international law, but the person just has to kind of fire straight away. When they see a light, they fire straight away, because then they have to be very, very fast. And there are two reasons. David talked about autonomous weapons. And there are two reasons, really, why we're having this push towards autonomous weapons. One is the speed of warfare. Warfare is getting very, very rapid. Weapons have to kind of be very, very fast. And the other aspect is humans are not ruthless enough That's what we're being told. And there's the desire to take humanity out of warfare. So we're seeing this push towards autonomy. And the other aspect, which again links to the last question about counter drones, is there is a whole new industry. The defence industry has been selling us drones for defence for the last decade. They're now, of course, wanting to sell us counter drones technology for the next decade. So it's how the military industrial system works, of course. There are two very interesting and very similar questions here about, it's not just about the technology, yes, and I think what David and what this session is about is trying to make people aware of what is of what is happening, and it's important, I think, if we want to challenge warfare and want to challenge the kind of the state of the world that it is, that we know a great deal about what's happening. But you're right. I mean, I think both of you are right. A lot of it is reactive. We're reacting to what's been happening. We do need to be more proactive. We need, very much to talk about and convince the public. We all try to do this, of course. That we convince people that war fighting is not an effective way of solving political problems or running the world. And so we need to do both together. And finally, in terms of, is it about the defence, the industry? Yes, it is. And again, I don't want to take away from what David's about to say, but both the UK and the US are insisting that they don't want to field autonomous weapons, but it's the companies that are pushing it. BAE Systems have said, and they said it in the Times report last year, that they don't believe the governments when they say they don't want autonomous weapons. They feel that the governments will change their minds, so they're going ahead and developing it. And of course, once this technology is in place, it's very difficult for countries not to field it. So it is, I believe, a lot of the military industrial, in their own interests, pushing this.
But also, the extent. Hang on, it's not switched on. The extent of autonomy is a sort of grey area. You press the button, and it's fire and forget. So it's autonomous for the last 10 minutes, maybe, depending how far away it is. Well, it is autonomous for the next hour. When does autonomy begin and person control end? So it's always fuzzy, and of course the pressure will be there, especially when the defences against drones, because the defences against drones will be largely about going for the communication, and then there will be the pressure. If you're losing contact with the drones, then make them autonomous. That's what the pressure will be. The companies will develop it and they will sell it. There's a point was made about the sort of value systems, and the thing about the autonomous motor cars is coming up is quite interesting, because they do actually have to program in a balance between saving the life of the car driver as opposed to saving the life of a pedestrian in a crisis situation. Which do you go for? And it was one of the reasons why they don't deploy it, because whatever decision they take, they might end up spending a lot of drag through the courts. But exactly the same will apply to the software in terms of finding targets. That as soon as it's autonomous, the decision making, can we kill 10 people for one target, will be then have to be programmed in and will be there explicitly and sort of provably within the software which is used within the weapon.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, Carol, are we going straight into the next plenary, or is it going to be a break?
We are, Cath.
Right.
My question hasn't been answered.
Yes. I tried to. I mean, we agreed with you, Wolfgang, that we need to have more proactive and positive.
But I think it need to bring it into things like landmines, because in some senses we know there's landmines because we know that they continue to operate even after the war is over, even when there's no targets there. That's why we go for landmines. But a lot of these weapons are essentially in exactly the same situation, and we need to fire it up that as autonomy creeps in, we should we need to say what level of autonomy is appropriate. Well, I mean, none, but you can see what I mean. There's a Rubicon which they mustn't cross.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I mean, lots of these sessions we kind of lay out what the problems are and leave you feeling very depressed. But there are other things that we need to do, and we've got his campaigners briefing, out of sight, out of mind, out of control, and we want to stop drones being out of sight, out of mind, and out of control. So there are a number of these we've left outside. So if you want to know what you can do about it, please grab one of these.
Thank you.
Implications about laser beam weapons, which I understand the armed forces are on the verge of applying.
Maybe we have a chat.
Yeah, I think because the previous sessions have overrun, and we don't want to go too far beyond the advertised finish time, and the next plenary is about to happen. So yeah, if we can talk about that after, I'm sure the speakers will be around for a little while to take any more questions after the last plenary. Can I just thank the two speakers for really illuminating this very terrifying